Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do something a little bit different, but we're going to keep that creepy vibe alive. I, as with many people, have always been really interested in the concept of an afterlife, what people say when they die, if there's anything that we're not aware of going on. So today we're going to look at a subject that I find very interesting, which is the final words different individuals said on their deathbed before they died. This is taken from a Reddit post and compiled by quotes from doctors, nurses, and care providers that have cared for these people in their dying moments. Number 20. Is this the last words of a delusional patient, or has he been seeing something that perhaps we cannot? The devil has been in my room all night, but don't worry, God's with you. This man had like the worst death ever too. He had a horrendous seizure and died with his eyes wide open. He had a horrible grimace on his face. He'd been yelling all night about the devil and saying over and over, "Get out of here, this building's gonna blow." Number 19. I can't write this without sobbing, but 3 years ago my grandma passed. She was stubborn as she could be, and the hospice nurse kept telling us it won't be long now, anytime, anytime. So there were about 20 of us, her kids and grandkids, her 80-year-old sister standing round the bed. It became quite uncomfortable, all of us just standing there holding hands, waiting. So I finally went over to her and whispered in her ear that I loved her and that it was okay to go. She and I were very, very close. After I did that, my mum did the same thing, then my grandma's sister. After a while, my mum said, "I remember a long time ago she told me she figured she would hear 'I'll fly away' as she entered heaven's gates." Everyone kind of chuckled, and my 80-year-old great-aunt a few minutes later softly started singing. Without a beat, all of us joined in as best we could. We were all crying, "I'll fly away, I'll fly away." At the end of the verse, of course, we were all just sobbing. Not 10 seconds later, her heart stopped forever. She just needed some help to fly away. This was years ago when I was a junior resident. I didn't know the patient all that well, but got called up to get her paperwork ready for discharge. She was otherwise healthy, but she had just had palliative colon resection for cancer. I went to her room to do a last wound check, and she kept talking about how she was going home to Bill. Her son pointed out that she's usually mentally very sharp, but Bill was her husband who had died years ago. He reassured her, "No, Mom, Dad's gone. We're just going back to the house." She insisted, "No, I'm going to him. He came to see me this morning and said he's taking me home." Whatever, I guess. It was the first and only weird thing she ever said. Her vitals and labs looked fine. Not even a few minutes later, the code blue got a call to her room. She was don't code, so we didn't do anything, but was like, I guess Bill really was coming for her. Her son was surprisingly okay with how this played out. Number 17. I work in long-term care, and one of my residents was dying from lung cancer. We knew it was going to happen any day, and she did too. She repeatedly stated she didn't want to be alone when she died, so all Friday night nurses took turns sitting with her. When I came in Saturday morning, they asked if I would sit with her. She was such a sweetheart. She had no children but had a niece who hardly visited. When we called the niece, she said, "Call me when she's dead." Anyway, this lady was labouring to breathe, in and out of consciousness, but would always squeeze my hand if I squeezed hers. Finally, I whispered in her ear, "The nurses just told me your niece is on the way." She died less than 5 minutes later. She just wanted to know that someone was coming. Her niece never came. A nice old lady told the hospital staff she wanted to wear all white. When asked why, she said, "The man in black is here." She looked into the corner of the room. We looked, but there was no one there. We asked her to describe what she was seeing, and she said, "He's all in black, and he's got a top hat on." Then she whispered, "And his eyes are red," while her eyes moved across the room to directly behind us, like she was watching him move closer to us. She died later that night, but it was unexpected. That room creeped me out for a long time after that. Number 15. This afternoon my wife and I were just remembering an amazing friend of mine, Kevin, who died a little more than 18 years ago. We did the math and realised that the son he left behind is now the same age that Kevin was when he passed. Kevin died from a reoccurrence of the same type of cancer that had first shown up in him when he was still in his teens, the same cancer that had also taken his father at the age of 34, when Kevin was just about the same age as his kid. He was a warm, funny, kind guy who had zero capacity for flowery talk or mysticism, so you'll understand why his last conversation with me has comforted me for nearly 2 decades. I went in to visit him at the hospital on what ended up being the final day of his life, and when he and I were finally alone, he leaned over to me and said, "Stan, there have been angels in my room on and off since just before sunrise." I asked him if he thought it was the morphine, which normally he would have been the first to suggest, and he said, "No, I'm not fucking with you, buddy. I'm not talking about feeling angels or anything. There are actual angels who keep coming into my room." I asked him if they were frightening, and he replied, "No, they're actually making me calm the fuck down a little bit." He passed later that evening. You know, I've always had and still have doubts about there being anything after this life. And of course, the pragmatic part of my brain recognises that it certainly could have been the medications he was taking, or some further metastasis of his brain, right? But if I'm being honest about what my gut tells me, or my heart, there were angels in my friend's room. You know what? Fuck it. I'm going to share one more story about him. A few weeks before the time I just shared, the two of us were talking about the possibility of an afterlife. He had just gotten word that things had taken a grim turn, and he probably only had weeks left to live. So it was a pretty earnest conversation. We discussed the idea of there being a heaven with a gate, and I asked him who he would like to be the first person he got to see after being let inside. And the fucker answered, "You." Then, after we laughed ourselves hoarse, he said, "No, I want to see my dogs from childhood." I'm gonna go hug my wife now. Much love, strangers. Much love. Number 14. Last year, my grandfather started desperately pleading for his life with his German captors from World War II. The doctor present was smart and said in German, "You're free, Herr Caricature, you're free." And then he died. Number 13. A 17-year-old female during a car crash uttered her last words. "Please, please, please, don't tell my parents I was drinking." Number 12. I was a hospice nurse for many years. Super gratifying job for a nurse, surprisingly. As a regular nurse, you're rarely offered thanks. Hospice nursing is an island unto itself. Mostly peaceful, lots of times sad, often a blessing. This is sad but also creepy, and I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it myself. I had a 20-year-old kid, gang member who was dying of primary liver cancer. Super unusual, aggressive and terminal. He was angry at the universe. His family was there to comfort him, but he literally spit in their faces. Every ounce of energy he had left was angry and mean and ugly. His last days, hours, moments, he was angry. The family called me into his room and told me they thought he was going. His lovely mother, in her dearest attempt, whispered to him to go toward the light. With his dying breath, he opened his eyes, looked at her, and said, "F your Jesus." A second or two later, he slowly turned his head to the left and got the most horrific look on his face, as if he were looking at something we couldn't see, and horrified like in a bad movie. His face contorted and he screamed with his last breath, his eyes wide. "Oh shit, oh shit, oh no." Then he made a guttural noise and promptly fell back into the bed and died. Every family member was shaking and too frightened to speak. I left the room and took 2 days off. I don't care if I never found out what he saw. Number 11. My grandma died in 1989. My granddad died around 1965. She never remarried, never dated, but she did have a great life. When she was dying, she yelled, "Bob, Bob, here I come. Oh honey, I've missed you so much." We always joked that we were glad she didn't yell, "Bob, who the hell's that?" Number 10. I'm not a nurse nor a doctor, but I'm an apprentice funeral director. We went to a nursing home on a removal, and as we were walking down the hall, one of the patients got antsy and opened the door to his room and saw us walking by with the stretcher. "See you next week, boys." And guess who we had to pick up the next week? Number 9. My mum was watching over my great-granddad in the hospital. He'd been unresponsive for a day or so, and suddenly he said, "It's about damn time you got here, I've been waiting." And then he promptly died. Number 9. I found one of my DNR comfort measure only patients standing at the side of his bed. It surprised me, mostly because he'd been unresponsive for quite a few days. I helped him back into his bed and he asked me why all these people were in his room. He suddenly became quiet again and I noticed he wasn't breathing. He was a DNR, so there wasn't anything to do to try to bring him back. Looking back, it still creeps me out at what he was seeing in the last minutes of his life. Number 7. My dad had MS. He'd had it since he was 18, diagnosed at 20, married my mum at 24, had me at 29, died 15 days short of 45. 6 months before that, he was put in hospice. He and Mum were discussing funeral arrangements, and my mum jokingly said, "You know, Tim, the best thing you could do would be to die on a Wednesday. That way we could have the body prepared on a Thursday, the viewing on Friday, and the memorial on Saturday, so more people could come." The morning we got the call that it was time, my mum, 2 sisters, and I were about 5 minutes too late. After we said our goodbyes, the nurse pulled my mum aside and asked if that day had any significance. It's not even 6 a.m. yet, so Mum doesn't even know what day it is, much less if it's important. The nurse tells her it's May 21st. No, nothing's coming to mind. The nurse told her that the previous day Dad kept asking what day it was and they'd tell him it was the 20th. He looked irritated but accepted. That morning he asked what day it was and they said, "It's Wednesday, May 21st. He smiled, squeezed his favourite nurse's hand and was gone almost immediately. It was Memorial Day weekend and we did just as he and Mum had planned, and despite many friends being out of town for the holiday, we had over 250 people show up at their memorial service, overflowing the tiny church more than it had ever been filled. To this dying day, he was trying to make things easier for our family. I miss him. Number 6. I had a patient come into the ER with shortness of breath. He started deteriorating in the ER and then quite rapidly on the transport up to the ICU. We got him wheeled into his room, replaced the ER lines and tubes with our own, transferred him from the transport stretcher to his bed. He actually did most of the transfer himself. He didn't say anything, but just before he died, he pleasantly adjusted his own pillow, laid his head down, and then his eyes went blank. The man just made himself comfortable before laying down to die. Number 5. But I don't know how to get there. Grandad was in hospice. He hadn't spoken in days. Died about 2 hours later. Number 4. My grandfather on his deathbed said, "They have no eyes." It still gives me the chills. Number 3. ER physician here. I've heard many last words from patients, but the creepiest one has to be a man who was on his last breath as he succumbed to renal failure. He said, "I see a bright light, horses, no eyes, no, no, no." As he'd loudly yell at this point, he was crashing when he suddenly woke up, looked at me, and with his last breath he said, "I understand," and he died. We know in the medical field that these situations are often provoked by a cascade of neurotransmitters in disarray due to tissue and organ failure, but I sometimes have my doubts and perhaps we're seeing more than we are led to believe. Number 2. My grandfather's brother. He died exactly 6 hours after my grandfather, and just minutes before he died he said, "I'm going to see you again, brother." He didn't know at the time that my granddad, his brother, had died. The family were going to tell him the next morning because he was having such a bad day. Number 1. The last quote I've chosen is one that reflects society today. In a country where access to affordable healthcare is not guaranteed, New York City nurse Derek Smith struck a nerve across the US after sharing the last words of a COVID-19 patient who minutes before being intubated asked, "Who's going to pay for it?" So that concludes our videos, folks, and I'm sure you'll agree, some are desperately creepy, others perhaps bring a little comfort. Thank you for watching, guys. If you like this content, please consider subscribing, give the video a thumbs up to let me know if you like this type of content and I can do more like this in future. Thanks for watching, guys. Over and out from Lisa Lives.